ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today for our talk, Hamilton, How the Musical Remixes American History. Our guest speaker is Dr. Richard Bell. He is an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland. He holds a BA from the University of Cambridge and a PhD from Harvard University. Rick has won more than a dozen teaching awards, including the 2017 University System of Maryland Board of Regents Faculty Award for Excellence in Teaching, the highest honor for teaching faculty in the Maryland state system. Rick has held major research fellowships at Yale, Cambridge, and the Library of Congress, and is the recipient of the National Endowment of the Humanities Public Scholar Award. He serves as a trustee of the Maryland Historical Society, as an elected member of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and as a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He is the author of two books, one about the history of suicide in America, and the other, which was released in October of 2019, which was not released the last time I saw you, so congratulations, is about kidnapping and slavery in the early United States. Its title is Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bell. You're on mute, Dr. Bell. Just one second.
You have to unmute.
There you go.
Unmuted. People can see me and hear me on my screen, right? Great, so thank you for that, Patrick, for that introduction. Thank you to Victoria for doing some of the technical behind-the-scenes stuff today, and thank you to the Albany Institute's Chief Curator, Diane, who I met last time I was in Albany, and Diane, I discovered, has forgotten more things about Alexander Hamilton than I will probably ever know. So it's wonderful to be back with the folks at the Albany Institute, and I'm just sorry this is virtually and via Zoom, which is no one's first choice. So thank you for bearing with us as we adjust to this brave new world of presenting public history in this particular format. I'm going to talk for maybe about an hour or so, and then we're going to move into questions. And as Patrick indicated, do use the chat button on Zoom to write a couple of questions if you have any, and then Patrick will read some of those out to me, because Patrick, I can't see the chat function, just so you know. Okay, so let's get started, folks. Does it really matter whether Hamilton the musical is good history? Does it really matter if Hamilton gets American history just right? This is a Broadway theater show after all, right? Look at this slide. Look at what these folks are doing on stage. It features singing and dancing founding fathers. I'll say that again. It features singing and dancing founding fathers. On the face of it, there's clearly something ridiculous about interrogating something like this for historical accuracy, as if it was a textbook or a documentary with a few songs thrown in. If you look at it, it's clearly commercial entertainment. And no one goes to other entertaining Broadway shows expecting much more than to be entertained. You're looking at SpongeBob SquarePants the musical right now. No one goes to see SpongeBob SquarePants the musical expecting SpongeBob and the guys to get marine biology just perfectly right. Surely that is not a Broadway musical's job. Surely it is enough if Hamilton gets people excited about American history. People who've been fortunate to see the show either live or on Disney Plus starting next month can then go read a history book about the subject. Goodness knows there are lots of them. Kids can just go ask their teachers. Shouldn't professional historians like me just be satisfied with that? Now, of course, we are not just satisfied with that. Personally, I think it matters a great deal whether or not this blockbuster Broadway musical is good public history. And I'm not alone in that, actually. I know that it's absurdly talented composer, librettist, and lyricist Lin-Manuel Miranda feels the same way. And I know that because he said so. I want historians to take this seriously. Miranda said to an historian by the name of Ron Chernow, on the day he signed a contract with Chernow to adapt Chernow's biography of Hamilton into a musical, and made Chernow the in-house historical advisor and consultant for this Broadway show. I want historians to take this seriously. And Miranda himself, who of course is not a historian, certainly took his own job very seriously, doing plenty of research in the real Alexander Hamilton's personal papers, reading lots of history books, not just Chernow's, but others too, about this period, and consulting with other historians like the Yale history professor, Joanne Freeman, who you can see in a happy selfie here with Lynn. Miranda certainly hoped that this show would be good public history. And that is a wonderful thing, because by now, in where are we, June 2020, an awful lot of people have seen it, and many more are just about to. Before the theaters closed, 7,000 people a week were seeing this show in productions in LA, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, London, and on 2 national tours. If you do the math, that's about, I think, if 8 shows a week, it's about 3.5 million people seeing this show live every year before it goes on the streaming platforms like Disney+. If only most books written by professional historians like me, and here's my latest book, had anywhere near that sort of impact that Hamilton the musical has. I'm not going to talk any more about my book, but I do have one. Hamilton the musical is a different species, a different beast, a phenomenon, right? It's a juggernaut. By any measure, Hamilton the musical has delivered much greater penetration, much greater reach, much greater impact than 1,000 historians' books or articles about the American Revolution or about the early Republic. This Broadway show's messages about these historical events are being consumed in vast quantities in live performances, and now soon through video streaming as well. The great success of this show then provides historians with the ultimate teachable moment. It gives folks like me a chance to congratulate and applaud Miranda for all the many things he gets right about the American past, and to draw your attention on evenings like this to the several moments when this great show falls a little bit short. And a great work of art deserves this sort of engagement. And I start my talk tonight with the sincere belief that there is nothing mean and petty about demanding the very best from our most obviously brilliant cultural producers like Lin-Manuel Miranda. We critique Shakespeare's works, right? We've done that for centuries now. We critique, we scrutinize, we engage with the works of American theater masters like August Wilson, Suzanne Laurie Parks, Tony Kushner, and so on. And we critique their work because everyone understands that their art, their work, their plays matter. And I believe Hamilton is a great play and a great piece of art too. And so I believe it's time that we began holding it to these same high critical standards. Now that said, I'm actually going to begin by paying earnest homage to this show. This is a show I genuinely love. I'm a huge fan of Hamilton the musical. And before the lockdown, I'd been very fortunate. I'd seen it in Chicago and in Cleveland and in London, where it played, you know, a little bit weird. And if I could only find a theater showing it tonight, I would be right back there seeing it again. I'm addicted to the soundtrack of this show, and so too are other members of my family. I have 2 young daughters, and I captured this video of my young daughter, Ruby, when she was 4 years old.
There's nothing rich folks love more than going downtown and slumming the pull up in the carriages and golf colleges and watch them talk. Take Philip Schuyler, the man is loaded. Uh-oh, but little Gussie knows that his daughter's Peggy, Jack, Eliza, slamming in the city. Watch up, guys. Work, Angelica.
Could most people see that? I heard one person jump in and say Sharon Shaughnessy could not see it. Could you raise your hand if you could hear it? Okay, I think it may just be a Sharon Shaughnessy problem, and Sharon, you might want to check directly with Patrick. So this video I shot a couple of years ago. I showed it to my now 6-year-old daughter the other day. She was horribly embarrassed by that little performance. But if she's embarrassed now, wait till I show that video on her wedding day. Then she will feel true embarrassment. Hamilton, ladies and gentlemen, is a tour de force. It's a masterpiece in many ways. The music and lyrics are, of course, the first thing that grab most of us when we encounter this show for the first time. What's distinctively powerful is this show's embrace of modern African-American music to tell this 18th century story. It's the generous helping of R&B that riffs on folks like Rihanna, Beyonce, Brandy and Monica, and the central use of rap and hip hop that snaps you to attention and makes you realize right away that there's something special going on in this show. There are all sorts of shout outs to well-known rap and hip hop stars, including Grandmaster Flash, Kendrick Lamar, Snoop Dogg, DMX, Busta Rhymes, Mobb Deep, Ja Rule, the Beastie Boys, the list goes on and on and on. Hip hop is, I think, a genius level choice to tell the story of the American Revolution. You might think that sounds like a joke, hip hop and the American Revolution, but Miranda didn't think it was a joke, and he was right. Hip hop is in many ways a genius level choice to tell the story of the American Revolution. Hip hop is a musical style associated with the streets, with defiance, with struggle, with ambition, with put upon people who are ready to rise up. Hip hop is also furious and fast. It's a black musical tradition notable for its lyrical dexterity and inventiveness. And we know that Miranda and his director in the original New York show, whose name is Tommy Kail, wanted that same hip hop spirit, that same fast and furiousness to live and breathe, not just in the music and the lyrics, but actually in the actors that they cast to play these leading roles. So in the original casting notices, and I'm putting sort of versions of them up on stage, Miranda and Kail went looking for human beings who would bring to mind different hip hop and R&B artists when they walked on stage and when they opened their mouths to sing. So we need to find someone who, when we cast him as George Washington, will remind the audience of John Legend, who has a certain gravity and dignity to him. When we find someone to cast as Angelica, she should bring to mind the fast-talking confidence of Nicki Minaj, or something like that. But of course, if you look at these casting notices for long enough, you'll notice not just the names of different rap and hip hop stars, you'll also probably notice some references to some Broadway characters as well. Do you see the reference to Javert under the Aaron Burr picture? Javert, of course, is one of the main characters in Les Miserables. I'm hoping you're all shouting that at the screen because you know it very well. What else have we got? Mufasa is also a main character in Disney's The Lion King. One of the things I love about Hamilton the musical are its obvious references to other Broadway shows that Miranda clearly loves. Shows like The Last 5 Years, like Beauty and the Beast, like 1776, like South Pacific, and like Pirates of Penzance, which is a show that Miranda was in back in his high school days, I think. And Miranda quotes those 5 shows directly in his own show, Hamilton. Now, other tributes to shows that Miranda loves, I think, are a bit more subtle than direct quotation, copy and paste. If you know the show Hamilton, you know that the first song is actually called Alexander Hamilton. It's the one that begins, how does a bastard, orphan, son of a you-know-what, blah, blah, blah. That's actually a riff on the opening number of Sweeney Todd, which is Stephen Sondheim's masterpiece. And Les Miserables also looms pretty large in Hamilton the show. Think about that. Both Hamilton and Les Mis focus on revolutions as being epic, emotional experiences. Both Hamilton and Les Mis use turntables to move between scenes up on stage, which is pretty rare and expensive on Broadway. Both Hamilton and Les Mis focus on a pair of men who literally circle each other for 3 hours every night. Hamilton and Burr circling each other, Javert and Jean Valjean circling each other as well. And Miranda has also pointed to Jesus Christ Superstar and to Evita, two shows that I grew up on over in England in the 80s, as other influences on his thinking about musicals. Because both of these shows, Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita, frame their stories by using their title character's worst enemy as the musical's narrator. So if you think about Jesus Christ Superstar, the narrator is actually Judas. If you think about Evita, the narrator is actually Che, based loosely on Che Guevara. And in Hamilton, you can fight me on this if you want, but in Hamilton, the narrator, I'm pretty sure, is Aaron Burr, the guy who will shoot him dead by the end of the show. And if you know musical theater or you love it as much as I do, you might catch whiffs of other Stephen Sondheim musicals, you might catch whiff of West Side Story, you might catch whiffs of Rent, and none of that is an accident. These are shows Miranda loves. Yet this show, Hamilton, is not just an encyclopedia of musical references, and nor is Hamilton the work of some solitary genius either. Because musical theater is the most collaborative art form we have in the United States. And to see Hamilton up on stage or on streaming video is to see how orchestration, staging, movement direction, costumes, hair and makeup, and the actor's own choices every night all contribute to the totalizing experience. The show that comes out of all that work looks graceful and effortless, but it is, of course, incredibly complex. The show includes 1,300 technical cues, and more than 20,000 words are spoken or more likely sung or rapped in the play's 2 long acts. And 20,000 words, by the way, is greater than most of Shakespeare's individual plays. And like Shakespeare, almost every line in Hamilton the musical is really good, a little masterpiece, really, with stuff to unpack and examine. Look, for instance, at these 2 lines. I've chosen them not quite at random, but they're pretty randomish lines. Burr will sing one and Hamilton will sing the other, so I guess they're a couplet. Burr will sing, "Yo, if you could marry a sister, your rich son." Hamilton will respond, "Is it a question of if, Burr, or which one?" This is, number 1, funny. Number 2, it goes to these 2 men's characters. Both of them want to marry well and marry up. Both of them are confident and ambitious and hoping to rise, but Hamilton is even more confident and more eager to rise than Burr. Is it good lyrics? Is it good poetry? Well, if I asked my students at the University of Maryland, where I teach, if this is good poetry, they would look at it for a hot second and they would say yes. I would say, why? And they would say, because it rhymes. And they're not wrong. It does rhyme, son and one. But do you catch the half rhyme in the middle of these lines? I put these words in bold to make them easier to spot. Let me read them again. Yo, if you could marry a sister, your rich son. Is it a question of if, Burr, or which one? That's sort of a half rhyme. I think it's called an internal assonance, and your brain doesn't fully catch that clever half rhyme because it rushes by so quickly. And that's true for almost any line in Hamilton, that there's something cool and clever in the middle of most of these lines, and your brain doesn't catch it all quickly enough to decode it and figure out what it was, but it catches just enough to know that something clever just happened, even if you don't get the processing time to figure out exactly what it was. There's all sorts of clever things in the show. Notice too how this show uses 3 duels to structure the action. Notice how the actors who play Hamilton's friends in the first half of the show generally turn up as his enemies in the second half of the show. Notice how the actor playing Hercules Mulligan on the left of my screen in Act 1, who is the muscle of the revolution, comes back to play James Madison, the brains of the United States, in Act 2. Notice how the actor who plays John Lawrence in Act 1, Hamilton's friend, will die, and that actor will come back to life and play Hamilton's son, Philip Hamilton, in Act 2, and will die again. How that actor dies twice every night, 8 times a week, in 8 performances a week, 16 times a week, and that's the first thing out of his mouth in the first line of the show. He says, "Me, I died for him." He could be talking about either of his 2 roles. This is some ninja level stuff from Miranda. And yet this show doesn't rub its cleverness in your face. This is a story with characters you care about. It is relentlessly dramatic. And some of its songs, I think, are just luminous. But is it good history? Well, in some ways, I think we could agree that maybe it is. Consider, first of all the things, large and small, that this show gets right about Alexander Hamilton's life, about the American Revolution, and about this nation's early history. Alexander Hamilton really did destroy the loyalist Hercules. I'll start that again. The real Alexander Hamilton really did destroy the loyalist Samuel Seabury's arguments. The real Alexander Hamilton and the real Hercules Mulligan really did go on cannon stealing adventures together. The real John Adams really did insult the parentage of Alexander Hamilton in words that I'm not going to repeat to you tonight. And the show tells us much more important things about the American past that most of us probably didn't already know or fully understand. Like, why was it that men of honor would take to dueling grounds, point guns at each other, and pull the trigger? The show goes out of its way to explain why people would do this thing we call dueling. The show also explains how voting used to work in presidential elections before the passage of the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment is not one of the famous ones, but it changes the rules because up until it became the law of the land, the runner-up in a presidential election, the loser, would become the vice president of the United States until we changed the rules in the 12th Amendment. Think about if we had not changed the rules. Think about the last 4 years of American history. If the president was Donald Trump and the vice president was Hillary Clinton, what sort of relationship would that have been like? You can probably see why they changed it, right? This show tackles George Washington's problems finding good lieutenants. It tackles the role of the French alliance in the war and the existential struggles to build a new system of government after the Patriots win the war at Yorktown. What comes next? King George asks the Patriots. Well, this show is brave enough to tell us what came next after that victory. It covers the creation of a national bank. And let's just pause before I go on here. This Broadway musical, this juggernaut commercial success, covers the creation of a national bank. That's sort of amazing, right? Does SpongeBob SquarePants have anything to say about the history of macroeconomic policy? I think SpongeBob is silent on that topic. A missed opportunity for SpongeBob and the gang. Hamilton the musical leans into it. Hamilton the musical covers the enigmatic deal over dinner that saw the federal capital relocated to the banks of the Potomac River. It covers George Washington's 1793 neutrality proclamation. It covers the descent into bitter party politics after George Washington's retirement from the presidency. In fact, the show gets the nastiness of national politics at the turn of that first century just right. In those scenes in Act 2, our founding fathers are suddenly not marble statues. They are instead a bunch of self-aggrandizing politicians. Madison schemes, Jefferson preens, Burr is ingratiating, and Hamilton himself is relentlessly self-promoting and self-obsessed. And to be clear, all of that is right on the mark according to the historical sources we still have. And if you knew nothing about any of this stuff before you saw this Broadway show, you could do a lot worse than use Hamilton as your American history textbooks. There are probably some states in the Union today using textbooks not quite as sure of themselves on American history as this great musical is. But Hamilton also gets a lot wrong. And I'm going to put something up on the screen right now, which is going to blur by before you can possibly read it. This is a list of about 15 or so plot points which are at odds with what we know from historical sources. So history tells us one thing happened, and this Broadway show tells us something different happened. If you want to take a screenshot or take a camera pic, you can. If you want to email me afterwards, you're welcome to do so, and I can send you this. Patrick can put my email in the chat if he wishes. But if you're scanning this list of plot points, which are, shall we say, at variance with what we know from historical sources, maybe you'll agree with me that these particular divergences from what actually happened, they're actually pretty minor. Miranda certainly knew what he was doing, and he made these changes intentionally, all in the service of presenting an intelligible and propulsive story that keeps moving and gets you out of the theater before 3 a.m. And remember, he's adapting a massive biography of Hamilton written by Ron Chernow. I bet some of you have read this biography. The one thing I remember about reading it most clearly is that it was 1,000 pages long. Maybe that's an exaggeration. 750 pages long. How about that? So Miranda is adapting a 750-page biography of Alexander Hamilton into 3 hours of all singing, all dancing, founding fathers fun. I bet that is really hard. There's a reason no one's done this before. And so to me, it seems wholly appropriate that Miranda might occasionally condense time, condense characters, and shift a few things around to get the larger job done. Still, despite all my praise for this great show, this is a show I genuinely love. I don't intend actually to let it off very easy this evening. I'm going to spend some of the time I've got left focusing in on, I think, 3 ways in which I think Hamilton actually stumbles quite seriously, falling perhaps a little short of being the best public history we could expect from someone so brilliant as Miranda. And let's start with the American Revolution. Now, it's difficult, I think, maybe a problem, that the person who's about to tell you about his beef with Hamilton and the American Revolution has a British accent. I can't help my accent, but I'm here to assure you that I'm not a propagandist for the British Empire. I'm certainly not a sleeper agent for King George III, because he's been dead a long time. Though I am the sort of proud British person who carries a full-length flag with them even when they're on vacation. But I'm not here to drape that flag around my shoulders here. I'm here to give you what I think is the straight truth that any historian of any nationality would tell you, which is that this show's depiction of the American Revolution isn't much more than the usual national mythologizing that we see so much in the American politics these days and in the American media. Notice that the patriot characters in this show never wrestle with their identities as rebels, as if being a patriot is just a given. Notice too that what they're all fighting for is actually pretty blurry. They all fight about singing for, I'll start that again, they all sing about fighting for freedom, but that's usually in the broadest possible terms. Freedom from what? Freedom to do what? As the American historian Andy Shockett has put it, what that freedom means to these characters is actually left left pretty cloudy, beyond a vague sense that no one should be able to tell them what to do, and that they desire decreased government interference in their lives. The characters on stage raise a glass to freedom, something they can never take away. And statements like that keep things just sort of hazy enough that audiences in San Francisco, in Tulsa, in London, can project whatever ideology they want onto that, because who doesn't like freedom? Up on the Hamilton stage, the revolution is a pretty simplistic struggle between heroes and their enemies, between patriot good guys and their unpatriotic adversaries, excuse me. Even though historians have been telling us for what, decades now, that between 1/3 and 2/3 of Americans initially wanted nothing to do with the fight for independence, this show offers its audiences nothing terribly tangible to suggest that there was ever any legitimate opposition to the revolution or any viable alternative to independence. Now, if you know this show, and I bet many of you know this show really well, you're probably wondering why the hell is he ignoring Samuel Seabury? So let's lean into this guy. There is, if you don't know the show, let me set this up. There is, in the first half of the show, a brilliant 2-minute encounter, confrontation between Alexander Hamilton, the American patriot, and Samuel Seabury, an American loyalist who does not want to break away from the British Empire. And it's the only 2 minutes in the show where we actually debate what the revolution is about and whether it's a good idea. So it's really important, and it does a lot of work for the show and for the audience. And I want to play you that 2-minute clip from the soundtrack, and the rights belong to Miranda, not me, because these 2 minutes are really important. And once we play them, we can then talk about what we've heard. Here we go.
Hear ye! Hear ye! My name is Samuel Seabury, and I present free thoughts on the proceedings of the Continental Congress. Heed not the rabble who scream revolution. They have not your interest at heart.
My God, tear this dude apart.
Chaos and bloodshed are not a solution. Don't let them lead you astray. This Congress does not speak for me. They're playing a dangerous game. I pray the King shows you his mercy. For shame, for shame.
Yeah.
Heed not
You
the
all unravel at the sound of screams, but the revolution's coming.
They have not your interest at heart.
To listen to you with a straight face.
Chaos and bloodshed
already
are
hard
not
to solve
a solution.
and even talk.
Don't
And what
let
about
them
Boston?
lead you
Look at the cost
astray.
and all that we've lost, and you talk
This
about
Congress does not speak for
My
me.
dog speaks more eloquently
They're
than
playing a dangerous game.
Your mange is
I
the
pray the King shows you his mercy.
Is he in Jersey?
For shame, for the revolution.
Repeat yourself again, I'm gonna scream. Honestly, look at me, please don't read.
Not your interest.
Don't modulate the key, then not debate with me. Why should a tiny island across the sea regulate the price of tea?
Alexander, please.
Bert, I'd rather be divisive than indecisive. Drop the niceties.
A message from the king, a message from the king, a message from the king.
So 2 things about that 2 minutes. Number one, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that amazing? If I had written those 2 minutes of musical theater, I would be really proud of myself, and I would probably take the rest of the month off to congratulate myself. I think that's lovely in so many ways. From an historical point of view, remember though, it's the only 2 minutes where we debate what the revolution is about and whether it's a good idea. And to my ears, what I notice when I hear that 2 minutes is that that debate, which I'm going to put in quotation marks, never seems to really be in doubt. That Samuel Seabury on one side is introduced via a harpsichord, for God's sake, that he doesn't get to rap, and that Seabury uses elongated vowels that make him sound fussy and stuck up, which means a bit like me, I guess. And he's usually played by a white actor, usually one of only 2 white actors in the main cast. And those pointed contrasts with the character of Alexander Hamilton work together to imply that this British sympathizer Seabury is old-fashioned, is conservative, and is wrong. And we see the same, I think, with King George, who's often one of the funniest characters up on stage and a real crowd favorite. But King George's political position is played for laughs, make no mistake, as if remaining part of the British Empire, the world's only global superpower at the time, was a completely ridiculous notion. But to people at the time, there was nothing ridiculous about remaining part of the British Empire. In 1776, there were in fact 30 British colonies in North America and the Caribbean. I've listed them here, they're also in red. Only 13 of those 30, fewer than half of them, would eventually break with Britain and set out on their own. The other 17, that's the majority, would stay put. A list that includes Jamaica, all the Canadian colonies, and actually Florida for a while as well, though as a British person, I would be happy if you had taken Florida then and there, but you chose not to. Florida burn. And notice how King George is portrayed on stage himself. This is my favorite slide I'm going to show you this evening. Look at these guys. The coding here is unmistakable. Like Samuel Seabury, the loyalist, King George is not permitted to rap, only to sing. King George is always played again by a white actor. And what's more, the actors who I've seen embody this role when I've been fortunate to see this show seem to have been directed to play King George as camp, as mincing, as effete, and as effeminate. In short, I think as gay. And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with a gay King George. But notice that the other big George in the show, George Washington, the Patriot leader, is never played that way. He's always played as perfectly straight, as glorified as the perfect American man. So in terms of directors' choices, at least, I'm not sure this is always as subtle as it could be. Let's just say that. Okay, immigrants. Immigrants, we get the job done. I am an immigrant to this country. I'm also now a proud US citizen. So sometimes I like to say we when talking about America. Immigrants, we get the job done is my favorite line in this show. For many of you, it might be your favorite line as well. And if you see the show on stage, the show always comes to a halt because of all the applause for this line coming from people like me in the audience. Immigrants, we get the job done. And in the show, that famous line is tied to a host of other lines, all of them together propping up a central narrative portraying Alexander Hamilton, the $10 founding father without a father, as an up by his bootstraps immigrant who got a lot farther by working a lot harder, by being a lot smarter, by being a self-starter. Alexander Hamilton, Miranda tells us, made his own destiny, going from poverty in the Caribbean to the height of George Washington's presidential cabinet. He wrote his way out. How to account for his rise to the top? Man, the man is non-stop, they sing in the show. Now, the idea of quick and easy, upward social mobility is, of course, at the root of our national myth-making in the United States. It even has a name in our country. We call it the American dream. America, we tell ourselves all the time, is a place of opportunity where no matter how humble our origins, we can make it if we try. Michelle Obama said those exact words. I just quoted her when Michelle Obama introduced Hamilton the musical at the 2016 Tony Awards. And because Michelle was sitting next to Barack, this nation's first African-American president, who I miss more with every passing news alert coming into my phone, you can forgive Michelle for believing the truth of what she was saying about how anyone can make it in America. Still, it probably won't surprise you to learn that most historians are troubled by this sort of frictionless portrayal of the ease with which a person on the bottom can rise to become a person on the top. Upward social mobility in the 18th century and upward social mobility now in the 21st century is actually far rarer and far more difficult than Alexander Hamilton and Barack Obama have made it look. I'm going to use a stupid cartoon to make a serious point here. And the serious point is that there are hard and high structural obstacles that actually block poor people and people of color most especially from achieving our shared American dream. To perpetuate the myth that all you need to overcome all of that is just pluck or guts is, I think, profoundly misleading and probably unhelpful. Not least because the real Alexander Hamilton actually spent his political life building some of these very obstacles. Despite his own humble origins, Hamilton would grow up to be an unapologetic elitist, more than happy for the new nation to be controlled by the country's 1%, by its bankers, its lawyers, its landowners, its merchants. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the real Alexander Hamilton's proposals famously included suggesting life appointments for all US senators and a life appointment for the serving president. I would say thanks but no thanks to that last one. These are ideas he modeled on the British House of Lords and the British monarchy, for goodness sake. What is he thinking? Listen to Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention, justifying his belief that working people, people he regarded as ignorant and lazy, should be excluded from any role in American government. This is his most famous quote. It reads like this. Hamilton said, "All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first and few are the rich and well-born. The other are the mass of the people. Now, the voice of these people has been said to be the voice of God, but however generally that maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true in fact. The people are turbulent and changing. The people seldom judge or determine right. So give therefore instead to the first class the distinct permanent share in our government. Government should be for and by the rich, not for and by everyone else." This is his most famous quote. And Hamilton's financial plan betrayed this same clear elitism. Hamilton's financial plan built a national bank that concentrated wealth and which delivered huge windfalls to rich investors who had bought up IOUs originally given to soldiers and war veterans in lieu of proper wages. And whenever working people would complain about getting the short end of the stick, the real Alexander Hamilton would come down on them hard. In 1794, the real Hamilton advised the real Washington to send out the army to suppress a protest by American farmers in Western Pennsylvania who were angry over a new federal tax on the price of whiskey. In history, that's called the Whiskey Rebellion. Some of you may have heard of that. And to Miranda's great credit, Hamilton's terrible advice to Washington was originally part of this musical when the musical was still being performed off-Broadway at the small public theater where it began. But as Miranda retooled the show for mainstream Broadway audiences, he cut out the Whiskey Rebellion for lots of reasons, one of which is that it doesn't make Hamilton look very good. And the real Alexander Hamilton's lack of love for immigrants was well known during his own lifetime. In 1798, the real Alexander Hamilton vocally supported something called the Alien and Sedition Acts, a flagrant attempt by President John Adams to silence political dissenters, especially Irish immigrant newcomers, by censoring them, by blocking their path to citizenship, and even deporting them when they failed to pledge loyalty to him. Alexander Hamilton thought those laws were great. In fact, he thought they didn't go far enough. Strange things for an immigrant himself to say. This is ugly stuff, folks. When I give this talk live in auditoriums, this is usually when the people gathered in front of me are very quiet, because it is ugly stuff, but it is the truth, whether we care to believe it or not. And as the Yale historian Joanne Freeman explains, and Joanne was the woman in the selfie with Lynn earlier on, the real Alexander Hamilton was, of course, a mass of contradictions. He was an immigrant who sometimes distrusted other immigrants. He was a revolutionary who later placed a supreme value on law and order when he was in charge. He was a man who distrusted the rumblings of the masses, but preached his own politics to them more frequently and passionately than many of his more democracy-friendly contemporaries. Hamilton the musical smooths over such inconsistencies, and for good reason. Alexander Hamilton's striving, hungry spirit is this play's heart and soul, and it does speak to our present moment, but the same man's realpolitik qualms, fears, prejudices, anxieties can dilute that message. And folks, what about slavery? In a show with a famously multiracial and multi-ethnic cast, it's particularly striking when you think about it that enslaved characters and other characters of color are actually absent from the Hamilton stage. I think that's a huge missed opportunity. Historians have been telling us for years now that people of color were actually central to the story of the American Revolution. But the Revolution is more than just the founding fathers. You could ask Crispus Attucks, the first person to die at the Boston Massacre. You can see him on the left. You could ask Cato, the enslaved man owned by the real Hercules Mulligan, who did most of Mulligan's intelligence gathering for him. New York City, where this musical is set, was home to thousands of African Americans during the Revolutionary War. They made up 14% of New York City's population at that time. 1 in 5 white New York households owned slaves. I think that many scenes in this great show could have been written to include characters of color. We know, for instance, that there were enslaved people in the room where it happens. They were the ones waiting and serving dinner to Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton while they negotiated, and yet the musical erases their presence. And while the show has a lot to say about how slavery is a cancer, the show does not allow us to see any black characters fighting slavery, because there are no black characters in Hamilton. The job of fighting slavery in Hamilton is a job reserved for white characters. John Lawrence and Alexander Hamilton will never be truly free until those in bondage have the same rights as you and me. John Lawrence, a white character, sings, "That's right." Alexander Hamilton, a white character, responds. Unfortunately, the real flesh and blood Alexander Hamilton is a very poor fit for the role of anti-slavery activist or white savior. Now, to be clear, this is where Ron Chernow and I go different ways. Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton, on which this show is based, does say that the real Alexander Hamilton was a dynamic abolitionist whose deeply held anti-slavery views stemmed from his own childhood observations of plantation slavery in the Caribbean. That's what Chernow says, and it's what the show says too. But many academic historians have actually criticized this part of Chernow's biography as being perhaps selective and skewed and being perhaps based on some flimsy facts. Because what we do seem to know seems to point actually in the opposite direction. We know that Hamilton's mother owned slaves when he was little. We know that the trading charter he's placed in charge of in the show's opening song is a slave trading charter. We know too that when he later married, he married into one of the wealthiest slave-owning families in New York. And this, of course, is the Schuyler family. If you've been following the news in Albany recently, you may know that a statue of Philip Schuyler was recently taken down in your neck of the woods. And the rationale for that was, of course, in recognition of his slave owning. The Schuyler sisters, his daughters, had 27 enslaved men and women in their service, doing the unpaid labor that made these sisters' lives of leisure possible. And once married, Alexander and Eliza appear to have owned at least 2 slaves of their own. And while Angelica and her husband were in London, Alexander bought slaves for them too, a woman and her child, and then sent Angelica and her husband the bill. The musical skates over all of that. The musical prefers instead to take Ron Chernow's lead and focus on Hamilton's brief membership in an anti-slavery group called the New York Manumission Society. That word manumission does appear in the show. And it's true that this group, the New York Manumission Society, was committed to encouraging the city's many slave owners to voluntarily free their enslaved laborers. And it is true that Alexander Hamilton was once a member. But it's also true that this group was far less revolutionary and far less radical than the musical and Chernow both imply. Many of this organization's own members were actually slaveholders themselves, and most of them decided to hold on to their own slaves. They want other New Yorkers to free their slaves. If only the members had followed their own advice. One historian calculates that if the members of the New York Manumission Society had simply given freedom to their own slaves, they would have freed, in a single stroke, 10% of the enslaved population of New York City, but they didn't. On the slavery question then, the real Alexander Hamilton was hardly a profile in courage. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the real Hamilton never spoke a word of opposition against its infamous 3/5 compromise. The real Hamilton worked harder than almost anyone else alive to ratify the final text of that Constitution, which contained, as any 12th grader could tell you, more than a dozen pro-slavery provisions. The real Hamilton, then, is a far cry from the singing, dancing abolitionist who could have done so much more if only he'd had more time. As one critic of this show has put it, because yes, there are critics of this show out there, the real Alexander Hamilton's life has been scrubbed with a kind of historical Ajax until it sparkles. And instead, the musical displaces the sin of slaveholding onto a single pair of shoulders, shoulders that belong to the character of Thomas Jefferson, who we know who's really doing the planting. Hamilton chides Jefferson during one of their rap battles, as if Thomas Jefferson was somehow singular among the founding fathers in owning or trading in human beings. In truth, of course, the Hamilton stage is swarming with historical people who did just that, not just Jefferson and Hamilton, but also James Madison, Hercules Mulligan, Charles Lee, the Schuyler sisters, and of course, George Washington himself. When it comes to slavery then, this otherwise great American musical isn't always terribly interested in the troubling truth. If you know this show really well, you may know that while there are now 2 cabinet rap battles in it, originally there were 3, that Miranda wrote a 3rd cabinet rap battle in which the founders actually debated the role of slavery in the United States going forward. Shall we get rid of it? Do we have to keep it? What on earth do we do? And that third rap battle eventually got cut from the show, but you can still find a demo of the song on something called the Hamilton mixtape, and you can find the lyrics floating around the internet as well. And if you do get to hear the song, which is no longer in the show, or find the lyrics somewhere on the internet, I encourage you to check out the lyrics because they're really good. They're really thoughtful, they're really complicated, and they're really provocative. And maybe that was the problem. Miranda himself said as much when explaining the several reasons why this third cabinet rap battle, the one about slavery, was cut. He noted that that rap battle over slavery provided audiences with an awkward reminder that none of the founding fathers did anything to stop slavery. Now, how this show's famous decision to cast non-white actors as the founding fathers affects any of what I've just said is a genuinely open question. On the one hand of that debate, most historians will tell you that casting non-white actors to play the founding fathers creates more problems than it solves. The Harvard historian Annette Gordon-Reed, who's a biographer of Jefferson amongst many other things, has put it this way. She said, because the Hamilton stage is full of black actors, audiences don't seem to notice that there are actually no black characters in the show. And she's right, right? And scholars, by the way, have a name for that sort of displacement. They call it blackwashing, the process of making something that was racist and terrible, like slaveholding, seem somehow palatable by retroactively injecting diversity into its portrayal. And it's powerful. It's blackwashing that allows us to recast slave owners as nothing more complicated than freedom fighters, and thereby suppress, I think, the grim reality of America's white supremacist past. And again, Miranda has said as much himself. This casting of non-white actors to play some slaveholding founders, he says, is a way of pulling you in to our story and allowing you to leave whatever cultural baggage you might have about the founding fathers at the door. Now, what does he mean by cultural baggage? I can't read his mind, I do not know, but part of the cultural baggage many of us have about the founding fathers is the slavery stuff, is it not? The race-bending casting helps us forget that most of our founders owned slaves, offering us instead a colorblind fantasy for the Obama era, a fantasy that suggests that America is and was post-racial when it wasn't, and it's not. Now, so far what I've given you is historians' point of view on the casting. Let me now give you the other side, because there is a different side. And Miranda, of course, sees things very differently to the ways I've just laid these things out. Miranda, of course, has defended these hugely innovative casting decisions, describing the decision to cast non-white actors as the founding fathers, not as blackwashing, but instead as a means to actually call out the hypocrisy of slave-owning founders like Thomas Jefferson. For Miranda, the casting is intentionally political, intentionally progressive. It's a gesture towards racial justice. It's a means to elevate Black people in American theater, in American culture, and in American public life. And despite my reservations as an historian, as someone who loves theater, I do think there's something very insightful about Miranda's side of this argument. Not least because this very unusual casting has self-evidently served to help many people of color feel more invested in the founding of this country and to give actors of color a slate of meaty leading roles. Leading roles for actors of color are surprisingly rare on Broadway. Take this leading man. His name is Akiriote Onadawan. He is the actor who played James Madison in the original New York cast of Hamilton. He's told reporters that as an actor of color in America, he's been hyper-conscious about which roles he takes and which roles he declines, and that he's allergic to doing yet another show about a messed up black kid dealing with the drugs or gangs on the streets. Akira Yotina Darwin has said that he has loved playing James Madison. I'm a black man playing a wise, smart, distinguished future president, he said. He gets what Miranda's trying to do, even if historians don't always do so. And audiences seem to get this too. As a writer named Rebecca Martinez put it in one blog post, I'm going to quote her now. In the days after watching this crazy musical, something switched for me. I hear the stories of this country coming from the mouths of this ethnically mixed group of performers, and I see myself. Seeing this musical, this version of an often repeated history, voiced by people who are often ignored by history, makes me want to rise up and make my own narrative known. She seems to get what Miranda is doing, even if not all historians do either. So let me wrap up by shifting subject and telling you very quickly the thing that historians love most about this show. It has nothing to do with the casting or with any particular plot point or fact. What we historians love most of all is the way that this show promotes the idea that history is not etched in stone, that history is actually constructed knowledge, that history is full of holes, full of biases, and full of points of view. Historians like me, we love the fact that textual sources that historians have to use as evidence to write history litters the Hamilton stage. When you see it on Disney Plus or live when it reopens in 2021, you'll see that the Hamilton stage is littered with letters and papers, with books and documents, and that what Hamilton and his contemporaries wrote is quoted at length in this show. Here's just a few of the direct quotations from historical sources in this Broadway show. And it turns out that this show has a lot to say too about how history is written and who gets to tell stories about the American past. The main characters raise these questions repeatedly. They gesture explicitly to the grand historical narrative in which they know they are participants, but which is still partly unknown and inaccessible to them because they have no distance from it. But they know there's a grand narrative. I'm erasing myself from the narrative. Eliza rages in the second half of the show as she burns her letters to her adulterous husband. Let future historians wonder how Eliza reacted when you broke her heart. At the show's finale, Eliza makes this same important and subtle scholarly point a different way by devoting herself to gathering Alexander's writings in hopes of securing his legacy through history. Creating his archive, creating his library, she tells us, is her way to make sure his story, his side of things gets told for all time. And Eliza is upbeat in that moment. But other characters rail loudly at their own lack of agency in shaping history and myth after they are gone. You have no control who lives, who dies, and who tells your story, Washington warns Hamilton midway through Act 1. After the fateful duel, Aaron Burr is also frustrated by his own inability to bend national memory to his will. Now, I'm the villain in your history, he tells the audience in the theater after he pulls the trigger. By killing Hamilton, Aaron Burr goes from being a complicated, sympathetic character to the cartoon bad guy of our historical mythology. History obliterates Burr Sings in every picture it paints. For me, that is one of the saddest, but also the most insightful, truest lines in this great show. It all depends, Miranda is saying, on who we let do the painting, that the choice of narrator matters. It matters in musical theater. It matters in all the stories we tell about the American past. And Miranda makes that powerful point over and over again so that we don't miss it. If you know the show, you know in Act 1, we see Helpless and Satisfied, two songs in which we see the story of Alexander's courtship of Eliza unfold from two complete opposite perspectives. That perspective matters. Think too about how Aaron Burr goes back and tries desperately to retell the story of the duel from his own perspective after we've first seen it from Hamilton's. In these ways, ladies and gentlemen, this Broadway musical is nothing less than a graduate seminar in doing historical research and writing. And I'm going to wrap up there. I've, of course, said a lot over the past, 60 minutes or so. Maybe I've said too much for some of you. To be clear, I'm not asking all of you out there to agree with everything I said. What you make of this great American musical is your own business. And if you do find yourself rejecting or resenting some of the things I've said about this musical tonight, take comfort in the fact that Hamilton can survive this sort of criticism. This show is a commercial juggernaut. It won 11 Tony Awards. It won the Pulitzer Prize for drama. Hamilton doesn't need protecting. Hamilton is completely bulletproof. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. While we give, yes, I see a couple people clapping, so we can clap for you there. While we give a couple people a chance to type in their questions if they have any. So if you do have questions in the chat box, go ahead and type them in. I will give everybody a brief minute. I remember from the first time I saw you give the talk, I believe somebody asked you the question, if you were to choose one African-American character that would have been placed into the musical, who would it have been?
Wow, that is a great question. I do not remember what I said last time, so I wonder if I'm going to say something.
I'm curious if you'll say the same answer too, but.
So let me just say that, so I told you for the last hour that there are no African-American characters in this show. There are lots of African-American actors, but there are no African-American characters. There's a tiny asterisk to that generalization about there being no black characters in Hamilton the Musical. Because for one line of the show, a line that takes about 4.5 seconds to sing, there is a black character. The line is sung by Thomas Jefferson in the first song in the second act. It's a song called What Did I Miss? Thomas Jefferson, who seems to be in Monticello for the song in Virginia, says, "Sally, be a lamb, won't you, darling, something, something, something." He wants her to pick up a letter or something like that. And suddenly there's a woman called Sally, who's materialized out of nothing, that one of the background dancers who are all unnamed and aren't given characters has suddenly become a person called Sally. And many of you can already guess who that Sally is, right? Sally is Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was the enslaved woman who Jefferson had sexual intercourse with numerous times and actually fathered some of her children. There's been a lot of historical research on Sally Hemings over the past 20, 30, 40 years, including DNA evidence proving that indeed Jefferson was the biological father of some of her children. And we've been able to learn 1,000 new things about Sally Hemings as a human being. In fact, I mentioned a Harvard historian as I was talking, called Annette Gordon Reed. She wrote an amazing biography of Sally Hemings and of the whole Hemings family called The Hemingses of Monticello. There is clearly a role for Sally to play. Even acknowledging her existence for more than 4.5 seconds would, I think, puncture the balloon that can sometimes inflate around the founding fathers if we don't think of them in the same context as the slaveholding context many of them lived in.
Thank you. The last time you gave a nod to Cato, Hercules Mulligan's enslaved person, as being somebody you thought would have.
Right? They're really
Yeah.
not starved for choices.
All right, so we have our first question from the audience. Ellie wrote, in the mixtape, sometimes John Adams makes an appearance, but he seems missing from the musical. Has Lin-Manuel Miranda ever explained why?
That's a great question. So John Adams is never seen in the Broadway show. And what you'll see on Disney Plus, if you see it next week, or if you've seen the live show, the character of John Adams never walks on stage. But you do actually hear his voice, I think 2 or 3 times. He booms over the PA system, over the loudspeakers a couple of times. I can't remember exactly what he said, but I think it's pretty unprintable, even if I could remember what he said. So I get the sense that Miranda has made a decision to streamline the number of characters in the second half of the show so that not every founding father is parading through the show. And one of those decisions was to focus on the entanglements between Hamilton, Washington, Madison, Jefferson, and Burr. I hope I haven't missed anyone. I think that's 5 people there. And of course, adding John Adams would be 6. So it's a streamlining measure. How John Adams functions more as a plot device than as a fully rounded character. He's someone who, according to the show, fires Alexander Hamilton, which didn't happen, and is another block to Hamilton's otherwise upward career trajectory. But he's certainly not a very fleshed out, well-rounded character. I've not seen Miranda's own commentary on the John Adams character or lack thereof, but I would direct people who do not know this next book I'm going to mention to it. There's a book called Hamilton: The Revolution, which is written by Miranda and I think a journalist, which does take us into the creative process that Miranda and his collaborators used. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was some commentary in there, I just can't remember, about the John Adams character. It's a fascinating look into Miranda's genius.
So we have a question from Harriet, who's actually 7, and she wrote that in her comments, and she asked, what were the use of slaves for people in the early American Republic?
Harriet, it's lovely to hear from you. My daughter, who is 6, is turning 7 in about 2 months' time. She is sick of hearing me talk about Hamilton the musical. So thank you for listening to this, and to your parents for letting you do so as well. So your question was, what did slaves do in this period? And there's no one answer to that, because in different places in America, enslaved people did different things. So in some rural colonies with lots of outdoors space and not many cities, places like South Carolina or Virginia, then enslaved people would do farm work, helping to make a tobacco crop for the person that owned their life and their labor, or the rice crop, and later on the cotton crop in other places too. But in cities like New York, and again, Hamilton the musical is set in New York City for most of the time, enslaved people there did all sorts of work, which doesn't fall neatly into boxes, but you can think of waiters, you can think of drivers of carts and carriages, you can think of delivery people, you can think of people involved in shipping and cleaning, generally the jobs that free people didn't want to do themselves. And in New York, that was a lot of jobs. So there were actually quite a lot of enslaved people in New York in the 1770s, somewhere between 10% and 20% of the population was enslaved. So that's a large number of people.
Thank you so much. That was very useful information. Thank you.
Welcome. Also, Harriet's an amazing name. I desperately wanted to call my second daughter Harriet, And my wife had other ideas, so now my second daughter is called Rosie. She's 4.
Have any last minute questions before we say goodbye to Dr. Bell?
So let me just say, by way of closing, I put my email address up on the screen as well as my website. I do encourage you to get in contact with me if you want to talk further about this. I can always recommend other books and articles to people who want to learn more about specific historical figures that I've mentioned. I can send you a long list of the books and articles that I read as I researched this talk, much of which is very positive about this great show, and some of which is very critical about this great show. There's a lot to read out there about the show and about the people it depicts, and this show is so worthy of any sort of spotlight and criticism and engagement. It's so rich, so wonderful. If Miranda was here, I would thank him for giving us this opportunity to talk about American history through the vehicle of his genius. So thank you very much for your time, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Bell, and thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight.